Let's be honest. When we look at our forward lines, we don't love it, do we? But could Dylan Moore be the solution to your AFL Fantasy Supercoach and Dream Team forward line this year? It feels safe, but it might just be the way to play it. Hey, it's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well. Welcome back to another episode of the 50 Most Relevant, where I look at who I believe are the players we've got to have conversations and look at the stories around these specific players for our salary cap and classic formats of Dream Team, Supercoach, and AFL Fantasy. As we look at Dylan Moore today, joining me on the podcast, he's a regular part of the Coaches Panel. You know and love him from the Pod, and every now and then you see him pop up on the Keeper League podcast as well. We're going to get him to a fourth podcast regularity by the end of 2024 if we get lucky. Louis, it's good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, good to be here, mate. Like I said in the last episode, love the 50 most relevant this time of year. It's a great time to really dissect these players and talk in depth about what their prospects can be for the season come.
Dylan Moore is a player that maybe you've looked at him in your teams and just went, no upside, so I'm out. Okay. Don't disagree in part with that narrative, but let's dive into the numbers. That's what the months of January and February should be all about, is looking at options, having conversations, and looking at all the considerations. As we look in depth at his 2023 from a Supercoach perspective, it's left him at a price point at just over $500,000. That's due to him averaging 91. Yeah, he's probably better than you realized a little bit. A top score of 139, 7 tons last year, and a career high score of 147. So your Hawks boy has got some ceiling through there. While in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, 7 tons in that format last year, an average of 88 means he's priced at just under 800,000 in AF and just over 810,000 in Dream Team. 132 was his top score last year, a career high score of 138. It's amazing, Louis, how quickly things can change in a player's relevance. 2 years ago, Dylan was lucky to be on an AFL list. He just couldn't find his feet in this Hawthorn side. And yet, while he's always been really strong in the defensive end, he never really offered much in a forward line that has always had some really damaging and crafty forward smalls in this Hawthorn unit. Now, he's shown how important he is and impactful he is. Take the fantasy data out of it for a moment. The pressure he brings, the avenues to goal, the things he sets up, the way this Hawthorn rebuild is going, restructure-wise, he's a really important cog, especially in this forward half.
That's it, mate. And there's a reason he's in a leadership role at the Hawks, I believe, is because he does lead by example and he does all the little things that coaches would love. I've got no doubt Sam Mitchell, he would be one of Sam Mitchell's favourites just because he is such an accountable footballer. And you're right, 2 years ago, it was almost like, see you later, might be on the way out of the AFL, but testament to his resilience and his character, what he's been able to do since. And he really has skyrocketed himself, not only into being relevant as an AFL footballer, but somebody that we're talking about at 33 and the most relevant, which is pretty impressive, quite high up there for a player of his type.
Yeah, you look through some of the names that we've unpacked through the 50 most relevant already, and I'm saying, again, it's a subjective list. You don't have to agree with my perspectives or not. That's not what the Coaches Panel is ever about. It's about giving you an opinion, giving you a perspective, and then giving you the information to make a decision off the back of that. I think he's super relevant. If we look into his data in a bit more depth for a moment, an average of 88 in AFL Fantasy last year, 7 tons and 3 scores over 120. Yep. The variables of ceiling and basement a little bit out at the moment with 10 scores under 80. And the pre-buy, post-buy split, not really drastically different. Supercoach, pretty similar to an average of 87.4. 7 tons, 3 over 120, just the 8 under 80, and we want to see that basement rise for him to really stay in relevance for us, especially if he doesn't have the frequency of 120 plus scores. But a pre-buy average of 87.4, a post-buy average of 95.6. Now, normally when we're talking about our forwards, we'd be going mid-80s, high 80s, pushing into the low 90s, jog on. Well, 2024 is different. We spent the 40s of the 50 most relevant really drumming that home of you can't just take 2024 strategy and copy and paste it from what you did in 2023. It's a really different game with different players, with a lot of different variables. So where's the upside coming for Dylan? Because we could look at what he did in 2022, but politely, while he's gone 90 plus basically over 2 seasons now, the reality is he was playing a lot of midfield time at the back of 2022. And I want to get your thoughts on whether you think that's a pathway, Louis, moving forward. But if you're trying to find a narrative of why to get Dylan, if you're looking for upside, which I know we all are, try this on for size. In wins last year, in the 7 wins the Hawks got, he goes at 104 in AFL Fantasy, and he goes at 111 in SuperCoach. There's about 20 points of value right there for you. In the final 5 games of the year last year, he goes at an average of 99.4 in AFL Fantasy and 104 in SuperCoach. In any year, not just in a year where we're really not enjoying the forward lines, Louis, those 2 numbers can stand out and go, maybe he does have upside.
Yeah, that's right, MJ. And it is encouraging given the role that he plays, because we saw at Hawthorn that there was a lot of chip football, but that was mostly in the defensive half. And that's why we saw a lot of those guys pop. Whereas Dylan Moore, yes, he works high up the ground. He's that high half forward. But the fact that he was able to get so much pill, in fact, he averaged more disposals in 2023 than what he did in 2022, surprisingly. It just really shows a defined role that he's one of the guys that is that interconnecting player going from stoppage up into the forward line. And I think it's like I said earlier, it's a real testament to the player that he actually is, because not getting those CBAs didn't really hurt him at all. He was still able to push high up the ground, provide that support option, and still actually bring his tackling pressure, which we knew him for over those first few years of his career. So he's kind of doing the hard bits now. So, he is a safe guy. I think he is around that 90 mark. But as you mentioned, in a forward line of 2024, that's kind of looking towards your premium end, at least to start this season. And that coupled with the bye, all of a sudden you just start to look at this guy. Well, his floor was 64 this year. Courtesy of Keeper League K's on Twitter. The only other player in that company was Dustin Martin. And just looking back at some of his scoring, the last time he went below that 64 was round 12, 2022. So a floor like that, you kind of like to see. You'd think that he would average a little bit more, but it just sort of says to me, if he can get on the end of a few more, then the floor's not the part that's dragging him down. It's not the part to worry about. It's what can he do on the other end of that. And if you go towards the fixture, if he can get some that pop early, and especially in a line where we've got, Jack Billings, Taylor Adams, James Jordan, a lot of these guys are going to miss one game of football anyway. So if you can put an extra 90 points on the board over that first 6-7 weeks, then not only are you a little bit ahead based on just that alone, but the upside potential there and the ability to perhaps even stash him away at F6 as we go greater into the season is there. And it's easy to forget that he's 24 years old too. He's still a young part of that Hawks side, even though he probably is looked as at one of the leaders as well. So,
yeah, how we tackle the forward line this year is of great fascination for me, because it feels a commonality approach across the community. And sometimes that's a good indicator to be able to get ideologies of what the community as a whole is really doing. You might refer to that as groupthink if you'd like to, that's fine. And then the other time it's important to run against the grain. But what appears to be a really popular thought process is locking away a player like a Jackson McRae or a Sam Flanders, and they're probably the 2 most popular referred to at F1, then taking a punt on these guys that are ranged anywhere from about 70, 65, 70, right up to about 80 that you're hoping can get you up to the 90s sort of range. We've covered a few of them in the 50 most relevant. Others that I'm about to mention might appear. So it's the Josh Rochelle, Elijah Sardis, Connor McDonald, his teammate, the Zach Fisher, the Taylor Adams. It's kind of like, I'll take one anchor, who I think's got upside, and then I'll take 3 or 4 hits, then I'll roll cows, and I'll spend an early trade, probably moving 1 or 2 of these mid-range breakout guys out and jump on. That's okay. That thought process is really quite common and probably going to work. Have you considered this play, though? Put Dylan Moore at F1. Does he present upside? Well, based on the wins and based on the final 5 last year, there's 10, 15 points per game of potential upside. Is his role secure in that side? Well, he didn't get any midfield time last year. Hawthorn ran a really unique midfield mix last year. I know Will Day's out for at least potentially the first few games of the year, but I think that will only benefit the likes of a McKenzie, potentially a Connor McDonald and a Josh Warder. I think it just elevates the kids to get a bit more of a chance. They seem to really like him and his craft in the forward line. So why not put Dylan Moore at F1? His basement, not great. Louis mentioned we want to see that lift a little bit, but it's not a disaster, especially in AFL fantasy. It's not a disaster. Now let him, because he plays through, as Louis mentioned, he plays through the opening 6 weeks of the year. He means you can start taking risks in other areas of the ground. Maybe there's a midfielder that you go, all of a sudden, I'll take a safety net F1. I'm not worrying about a McRae or a Flanders and a role and a style and a hope. Instead, I'll now look at a midfielder like a Cam Guthrie that we did an episode with Rids, or Jai Simpkin, who you and I spoke about not too long ago, Louis. All of a sudden you're going, I'll take the safety hit here. He might not be the top of the line. He might not by season's end be top 10, but he's shown back-to-back seasons of being a 90 forward in a bunch of different roles. He's now set in that forward line. I'll take some flyers through the midfield who historically are greater ceiling scorers than guys that might be in my forward line. And all of a sudden, there's a narrative pathway. But what do you see people doing in the forward lines this year, Louis? It feels like everybody's coming to grips with not a whole heap of great options and trying to find the right value mix, not just in this line, but how it balances out with the mids, the rucks, and the defensive line. What's your early read? I know AFL Fantasy is your game of choice, but you do play the others. How do you see people navigating this, and where might a Dylan Moore help or hurt you as a structural strategy?
Well, at the moment, I think I'm definitely seeing a trend of people picking probably these underpriced guys. I think it's easier to build a narrative for some of those blokes that you mentioned earlier that may or may not enter the 50 shortly. There's more of a narrative for them to jump up to that 90, whereas with a Dylan Moore, as you've mentioned, he's that safe 90 now. And as we've said, he's doing that without a lot of midfield minutes. He's just doing it on pure, pretty much football ability, working up and down the ground. You mentioned a Will Day injury. He's not going to go into that midfield. If he was going to go into that midfield, I feel that we would have seen it when Tom Mitchell and Jaeger O'Meara left that midfield last year. He wasn't the incumbent of that. In fact, his midfield minutes went down, but I'm actually kind of seeing that as a positive. So, look, maybe Josh Ward goes inside a little bit more. That just gives Dylan Moore, I guess, a little bit more freedom to take more of that outside ball because he's not going to be an inside guy. He does have that propensity to be able to, if he needs to. He's got that defensive pressure, which we love. That's no disrespect, kind of the easy part of scoring. He's already doing the hard part though, which is finding the ball without having that stoppage attendance. So I think if you're picking Dylan Moore, you're banking on a 90 guy. You just want to put the points on the board, not worry about the buy early on. And look, best case scenario, yeah, that maybe there is 5 to 10 points upside. You mentioned those wins. I think Hawthorn are going to have a massive upswing this year with just their young talent. And I think Sam Mitchell's got his head screwed on and using his players to the best of their ability. So, it remains to be seen in terms of the forward strategy too. I think so much of this is going to be dictated by what happens 2 months from now. In fact, I wouldn't begrudge anybody to let their forward line sit on the basis of opening round, just because there are so many players that are playing that opening round that you will cop the buy early on. So if he goes, well, let's say he goes 105 in the preseason game and maybe does something similar in the unofficial one, then all of a sudden There's probably people listening back to this podcast right now thinking, oh, Dylan Moore, okay, what's the story there? And look, we know the story. Across 2 seasons of footy, he's gone at 92 and 89. It's very consistent football for a high half forward. And I think being the age profile that he is, the leader that he is, it's hard for me to spin a narrative that there's a whole heap of downside there. I think, as we've backed over countless times already, he's that safe guy.
Yeah. How you look at a Dylan Moore and how you play your forward lines ultimately speaks to the type of coach you are. If you are hunting for scoring upside and financial value with most of, if not all of your picks, the only way you fall into selecting Dylan Moore is you believe the 99 and 104 that across the formats you got in the last 5, and the 104 in AF and the 111 in SuperCoach in their 7 wins last year is closer to the normative for what will become the new narrative for Dylan Moore, rather than, high 80s, low 90s, float in that range across the year. If you don't want or believe the upside is coming significantly, you will fade him, because as we've covered through the 50 and on this episode today, there is a ton of options and you can pivot and move really, really quickly. Equally, if you look at your forward line and go, I dislike this entirely, do you just want to build a safety net and an anchor at F1 or F2? And Dylan becomes the safety net to allow aggressive moves elsewhere. He's priced somewhere in the formats that I know in SuperCoach and DreamTeam especially, traditionally we wouldn't trade out of. But if you've nailed the cows, and that's the big premise, if you nail the cash cows, you can move really easily from a guy at his price point to the guy that is popping, whether it be a forward or an alternate line. So is Dylan Moore relevant? You bet he is, because whether you select him or not, whether you're a safe approach coach or you like to increase your risk profile, someone like a Dylan needs to be included. He's got ceilings of 130s. He's got some basement of some 60s, but there's a guy to consider. And don't just go, there's no value, there's no upside. No. Spend this time in the preseason looking at all considerations for how you structure up your side.
Yeah, and he will still be a big watch in the preseason. One asterisk I'll put on him is that Hawthorn, we believe they're going to be fantasy relevant this year. They've got a lot of young talent which are on the rise, which just wasn't the case, 2, 3, 4 years ago. So potentially there is that situation where maybe he comes down a little bit while the others improve around him. But that's just going to be dependent on sort of his responsibility and his role within that team. That wouldn't surprise me either. That being said, we mentioned his floor. I don't think 64 in AF is terrible at all.
61 in SuperCoach. Yeah.
I think, his ability to be able to play games as well and not get injured is really high up there too.
Yeah, good shout. Yeah, he's super durable, super reliable, and has ceiling. Where are you going to go on draft day, though? That's a really interesting conversation. Due to his average, he's a top 10 guy across the formats for us. So I know you're thinking us talking about this guy, you're going, MJ, Louis, he's not relevant. Well, one, you've not been listening to the episode if you think he's not relevant, but he's higher in the tiers of forwards than we probably care to admit. I think there's 2 approaches to drafts this year, Louis. I know it's mid-January as this episode's come out. And so maybe you haven't got your arms around exactly how you'd like to approach a single season draft, and everyone coaches differently and strategies different, but it does feel like you land in 1 or 2 camps with your draft strategy. One, early, maybe not your first pick, but definitely second or third round selection. You lock away a top 10 forward, or you completely throw the forward line out and you go, it's only in the mid to the late range of the draft, unless somebody undeniable slides to me. I give 0 cares about the forward line. I know it's hard to know when you're not in the midst of a draft and you see the nuances of a draft moving. He'll be an F1 for someone. That's not going to be a question. Where do you think is the right sort of time to pick a guy like him, who, as you've said a couple of times, really safe 90 guy on the formats?
It's really going to be dependent on where those other forwards go around him, I think, MJ. He's a really hard one to pinpoint. It's going to be up to the league just about. I think whoever does draft him will probably go a little bit early, and I think it will put just a slight bad taste in their mouth. But I think come round 6, they'll come around and think, oh, hang on, I thought I went a little bit early on this guy, but he's done, 85, 90, 85, 90, while, maybe there's somebody else out there who people were bullish. They got that classic hype and it didn't quite fire up enough. So, to be able to bank on that week in, week out, it's nice in classic. It's so much more valuable in drafts.
Certainly is. A general rule of thumb guide. Every draft has its unique variables of squad sizes, on-field players, all those things. But a helpful base rule of guide that we use at the coaches panel is add 10 points per game on the average of a defender and a forward to align them with where you should be looking at placing alongside a midfielder, which would put him at the 100 mids, which, there's about 25, 30, 35, depending on the formats you play. Okay, all of a sudden, that's where once the low hundreds, high 90s, mids start flowing off the board, if he's still there, jump on. But like you said, there will be people that get to that 4th, 5th round of a draft and go, I need a forward and I can build around him. Absolutely fine. Absolutely fine if that's the way you want to play it. Hey, Louis, always a pleasure to chat to you, mate, and talk about a really interesting fantasy prospect yet again.
No, thanks, mate. Hope everyone enjoyed.
If you want to go and read the article, it's online for you now at coachespanel.tv, as well as every other player we've revealed so far in the 50 most relevant. And gosh, we're a third of the way through, more than a third of the way through. It's absolutely crazy. I'm not great at maths. That's not good, considering the amount of data analysis I do for you. Hey, if you want to go and check out the podcast, make sure you do wherever you're listening to this one. Make sure you go and subscribe, give it a 5-star rating and a review. It helps us and others in the fantasy community to discover the coaches panel. And also you can go and watch the videos on YouTube as well. Louis has some of the greatest bit of facial hair. I'm trying to deflect the hair conversation. Can you tell? So you can go and check that out on the video. Subscribe to the channel.
It won't be around for long, mate.
The missus will say. So if you want to check the videos out, turn the notifications on and comment below too on what you think about the player in question for the 50 most relevant. In 30 seconds, I got a clue for you about who's coming in at number 32. But one of the great things you can do to support the coaches panel this off-season and pre-season is become a Patreon. Everybody's given up their time to be able to provide you great fantasy footy content. And by becoming a Patreon, it certainly helps us with the things we need to do to be able to get the content to you. And as a reward, not only do you feel good about it, but you get bonus content, hidden group access, extra videos, podcasts in the preseason and through the season proper, draft rankings, round reviews, and a bunch of other stuff, including if you sign up to the breakout or premium tiers, well, you'll get these audio podcasts a day ahead. So the clue I'm given for who's at 32, they're going, know that, we're ready for number 31. So who's at number 32 in my 50 most relevant? I'll tell you this. If you took your fantasy footy serious in any format last year, you had this guy. You had him probably, I would think for the most part, from round 1. Chances are you had him for, if not most, almost the entire season. He's a premium in his line. Who is he? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.